I've already expressed how much it means for me to see you all gathered here in this place, colleagues from across the globe, working at the highest possible levels of academic research, along with some of you who have been the greatest supporters, financially, personally, spiritually, to both Heather and me, and also to this institution, to the Center of Theological Inquiry. I hope there's a chance to thank and express my gratitude to each one of you personally. But what I want to do as the incoming director, before I get into my own lecture, is just to pause for a moment, to take stock of what this event is and what it involves before making my own very paltry contribution to it. I'll talk in a moment to you all about the foundation of CTI, but suffice it to say for this moment that this place was founded to be the theological equivalent to the Institute for Advanced Studies just down the road in Princeton. The Institute famously was the location at which Einstein was a professor and where Oppenheimer, who led the Manhattan Project developing the nuclear bomb, was director. We are modeled after the Institute, although our founding documentation says, albeit on a humbler scale. I've put a dash in my notes here and said, for now at least, a mere 75 to 100 million more would make us proportionately far less humble than they are. So much as it beleaguers me to say this as a Methodist, should your lottery numbers come up, please do remember us and think of us, because you could make the most significant, important, and famous lasting contribution to theology possible, and make us even more famous, important, and significant than the Institute for Advanced Studies is for physics. To be the equivalent of the IAS, we have to gather together the very, very best academics in our field. So no B-listers are allowed into this place. And I also have a very firm rule that no jerks are allowed into this place either. So if you are here, you have the accolade of being part of a very, very small group of people who are both A-listers and not jerks. And that's a surprisingly small number of people within the academic community. To prove that we only have A-listers here, I want to reflect for a moment on the people that we have gathered here for these 3 days to give keynotes. Heath Carter, who started us off yesterday, is his generation's leading historian of American religious life, who is shaping and reshaping his own field. Kate Sonderegger is without question in my mind the greatest theologian of the 21st century and the most significant voice in systematic theology since Karl Barth. Laurie Zoloth is both the leading bioethicist of our age and the world's leading Jewish ethical thinker and philosopher. Valerie Cooper is doing the most exciting and hopeful work on race and theology in this generation and is, I believe, the true heir to Martin Luther King's vision. Robin Lovin is the best-known ethicist working in the American realist tradition of his generation, and he has shaped a number of institutions, both as dean and through his own academic work. Sister Gemma Simmons is the second best-known Jesuit thinker that I can think of. I say second best-known Jesuit thinker I can think of because, of course, the first best-known is the late Pope Francis. She's somebody, though, who would give him a run for his money, I suspect. And she is the most extraordinary Christian broadcaster in the UK. Sir Ian Torrance is the most important theological institution builder of our age, whose very theological vision has shaped not only Princeton Seminary, but Aberdeen University, the Chapel Royal in Scotland, and I would say the whole state of our field. When the history of theology in the late 20th and early 21st century is written, it will be Ian who will be the quiet hero of the story of theology's renewal and revival. Will Willimon is America's best known and most influential preacher, rated so by Time magazine, which means it must be true because this building was built originally with money from Time magazine. And he's also the most frequently read theologian in the Protestant tradition by pastors in the US. That seems to me to probably be the case because he's written as many books as everybody else all combined. But that has been established statistically by Pew Research into pastoral leadership. Jeremy Begbie is not only the leading global voice in theology and the arts, but he is the very person who created that burgeoning field, a pioneer who has shaped and created a discipline. Friederike von Oerschot is the world's leading theologian working on artificial intelligence and to my mind, the most exciting theologian currently writing in the great German tradition. David Wilkinson, from whom you'll hear later today, is the world's leading voice in theology and science, and the leading public apologist of the Christian faith in a deeply accessible way. I should also say that David was my minister when I was a teenager, and he was the person to whom I was apprenticed as a preacher. So if you don't like my sermon tomorrow, blame him. Mihailo Schiele is frequently rated as Ireland's most significant living poet, whose work has made the kind of contribution to poetry seen only in a handful of people in the world of poetry over the last century. He will be ranked along the likes of Eliot and Auden in posterity. Grant McCaskill is, to my mind, both the world's leading technical New Testament scholar who can have conversations with you about engaging between Ethiopic and Old Slavonic in relation to the text of 4th Enoch. But just in case it puts you off going to his talk later on, he is also somebody who is seamlessly able to talk in accessible ways about issues such as covenant, humility, and autism as they relate to the biblical texts. Dr. Marilyn Robinson is repeatedly held up as America's greatest living writer, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, amongst other accolades. But she is also, though perhaps she would not describe herself in this way, and I hope she forgives me for doing so, the most well-known and the most well-read public theologian in the world, as her work is as richly theological as it is stunningly beautiful. And John Guerra is one of the best-known Christian musicians of this era, frequently lauded by his peers, and without question the most theologically sensitive contemporary musician alive. And then there is Georgina McMaster. Georgina is the UK's leading wildlife artist who has composed a whole exhibition on creation for this event, All Things Wild and Wonderful. And I hope that you will take time both to come on Sunday morning and explore these in detail, but to look while you're here as well. I have to say, therefore, that it is both humbling and utterly terrifying to be offering any words whatsoever amongst this cast of absolute giants. To each one of them, as well as to the people of equal caliber and standing, speaking at next week's MacDonald Agape-sponsored colloquium next week, I am deeply grateful to you for being here. That you agreed to come is an honor without measure. Thank you all, because it means more than you could ever know. But there is something more important to note here rather than just this wonderful gathering. Because bringing together this level of people into one place for a period of time is precisely what CTI was founded to do and achieve. I am unsure that there are any other contexts which could draw together this cast of grandees from across theology, science, and culture. And I think it is worth, amidst everything else, just pausing for a moment to note this. I want to say that I believe this to be a 3-day theological equivalent to the Manhattan Project. This is precisely what we were founded to do and to bring about. And this event, I should also say, thanks to the work of Josh, comes off the back of a wonderful visit last week from the deputy editor of the New York Times, and also the former podcasting host for the Microsoft Research podcast just over a week ago. And it precedes an event sponsored by the MacDonald Agape Foundation on Word and Sacrament next week, with another great list of A-lister theologians speaking. In an age when we can record these talks and spread broadly what we do here at CTI, thanks to this wonderful new building that we have, the result of the vision of my predecessor, Dr. William Storer, who sends his greetings and is very sad not to be able to be here because he's taken up a preaching gig in Scotland. Because of this new building, our possibility of fulfilling our mission and cultivating a theological renaissance in church, university, culture, and society has never been more possible. This event shows that the faith that our founders placed in investing their money and resources in this place was wise. It was a wise investment that bears a fruitful legacy today, long beyond their imagining. And for them, we should also pause and give thanks. But to my lecture. I've taken as my topic today, Be Transformed by the Renewing of Your Mind, a Vision for Theology. The words I've chosen are words from Paul, which I will also preach upon tomorrow, but they are core to my vision of a theology that has the capacity to be transformative. And for real transformation to happen, it has to begin from within the human being and how we think and how we perceive the world. If we are to repair what has gone awry in the world, it involves, to employ a term used by the Jewish philosopher Peter Oakes, who will be attending tomorrow's service, a reparative mode of reasoning, which will enable us to bring about transformative impact in the world. A reparative mode of reasoning, which will enable us to bring about transformative impact in the world. But the key to it, I want to argue, is this. Only deep thought can have long and broad-lasting effect. Only deep thought can have long and broad-lasting effect. What I want to do as I think about this topic today from the vantage point of being the new director of CTI is to consider what this might mean in terms of the context in which CTI was founded and the context in which we live now. And I then want to think about why theology might make a difference to this context, and finally, how theology might make a difference to this context. And there will be 5 moves in what I have to say. So if you're getting bored going through, what you can just do is count to 5. And once we get to 5, wake yourself up. So the context in which CTI was formed, I want to say, is the context in which we live today also. The context in which CTI was formed is the context in which we live today also. The origins of CTI rest in a letter from 1957, which is displayed in a frame in my study, from Robert Oppenheimer, the then director of the Institute for Advanced Studies. It is a letter to Reinhold Niebuhr, offering him an appointment as a visiting professor at the Institute in 1958. This was a remarkable, almost scandalous idea that this Center of Scientific Inquiry would host America's best-known theologian. Niebuhr accepted, and we can read in his letters that the only positive thing that he had to say about the Institute for Advanced Studies was that he was delighted with the ultra-modern apartment that he was given with an entire fronted wall of glass. While his wife loved Princeton because of the shopping, this is something which is also true for me, Niebuhr said that Princeton was fine so long as he didn't have to be there for more than a year. It was at the Institute that Niebuhr wrote his Structure of Nations and Empires, examining the Cold War brought about by the nuclear impasse, which was brought about in turn by Oppenheimer's own scientific discovery. Who can know what was in the mind of Robert Oppenheimer in inviting a theologian to the hallowed halls of his scientific institute? But what we can know is that Oppenheimer was deeply concerned for serious and ethical thinking about what science and technology now made possible. Oppenheimer disliked the word God, he would say quite often, because he thought it was too ambiguous. Well, maybe one of the things we can do is to make it slightly less ambiguous. But he did also, in 1958, give a lecture and respond to questions at Princeton Theological Seminary about the state of science in our age and the questions that it raises for metaphysics and ethics. And to appoint a theologian to the institute at the same time was a radical, scandalizing move. None of this can have been lost on the young incoming president of the seminary, James McCord, about whom we heard a good deal yesterday from Heath Carter. And McCord began to conceive of the idea of a faculty of theology in the Institute for Advanced Studies, a place where theology could be pursued with the same seriousness as theoretical physics or mathematics was being pursued, a place which could cultivate a theological Einstein or a theological Manhattan Project for the good and without the destruction. That for the realization of this vision, for which McCord would receive the Templeton Prize, theology's equivalent to a Nobel, he built this very place, the Center of Theological Inquiry. I have to note, by the way, rather splendidly, that for all of the comments about this being a humbler place than the Institute for Advanced Studies, McCord took the decision very clearly and obviously to change the preposition to of for us. So we are not merely the Center for Theological Inquiry, we are the Center of Theological Inquiry. And his accounts of humility are also somewhat undermined by the fact that rather than call himself director, which was the title of the head of the institute, he called himself chancellor of this place. So McCord clearly had plans for that 75 to 100 million. In many ways, our history is one of imagination and daring, beginning with Oppenheimer and ending with our incorporation in 1978 as a place where the work of our centre would involve but not be limited to four things. First, the relation of theology to other university disciplines, both human and natural sciences. Second, the condition of religious pluralism. Third, the present state of faith and quasi-religious faith in the world. And fourth, the role of faith in the contemporary world, including the performance of it. Upon opening the original building here at CTI, McCord wrote the following, which in many ways draws out the kinds of concerns that he had. I'm never very good at doing more than one thing. This is the situation I'm told by my wife of being a man, that multitasking is impossible, and clicking along doesn't do very well. But here are some, various pictures of what was imagined along the way. McCord said this: research in the physical and natural sciences, as well as the humanities, is growing at an astounding rate. On the industrial front, the business sector recognizes that it must invest a substantial proportion of its income in technological research and experimentation. To meet their particular needs, these groups have established centers for research at the most advanced levels, where scholars have special resources to conduct investigations that they would be unable otherwise to undertake. He continues, theology also requires research, especially if it is to grow in the right direction, to reach new and expanding communities, and to meet the challenges of rapidly changing world events. Unfortunately, theology has not kept pace with its research requirements. There are two reasons for this. First, adequate funding has not been provided. Second, the little research that is done remains tied to academic centres that are hampered by limited staff and multiplying responsibilities. For the past 2 decades, an attitude of anti-intellectualism existed against doing research in theological matters. It was thought that such research was futile and had little to say to the contemporary world. Funds were rarely forthcoming for theological investigation. These opinions are now undergoing dramatic change. A real theological renaissance is at hand. But, says McCord, existent universities and seminaries are not equipped to undertake the type of advanced theological research that is now needed. They were words written 50 years ago that I feel I could have written yesterday. What we might note, therefore, in putting these pieces of history together is the following for the context of the founding of CTI. First of all, rapid advancement in technology causing human anxiety. In that instance, the nuclear age. Second, the geopolitical consequences associated with that, the Cold War. Thirdly, changes in society which led to the realization of a complexly secular and pluralist setting over and against an homogeneously Christian one. Fourth, subsequent disruption as a result of that of mainline Protestant churches and their power. And fifth, a consequent sidelining of theology in both the intellectual and the ecclesial arenas. The need to think about these conditions and contexts seriously was key to CTI's foundation and vision. But I am struck by the fact that there are such extraordinary parallels there to today. Let's consider them. The context, first of all, of rapid advancement of technology causing human anxiety is also a feature of today's world in relation to artificial intelligence, as we've already heard. The political consequences of these changes are in the capacity for changed and enhanced modes of communication to provide algorithmic echo chambers for political positions, leading to intensely binarized and divided political cultures. Third, rapid changes in society leading to the realization of a complexly pluralistic and secular setting in place of an homogeneously Christian one has sped up since the millennium and got even faster since COVID. And the rate of progress on this has been enhanced, particularly in the US in recent years. And yet all the while, strangely, Generation Z, I guess I should say over here, Generation Z seems to be reading the Bible more regularly than any other generational group, which is strange. Fourth, the disruption of mainline Protestant churches and their powers has been exponential in terms of new forms of Christianity becoming the dominant voice and even taking over the political sphere. And then fifth, as a result of this, the sidelining of theology in the intellectual and ecclesial arenas has deepened in a context where church shopping and ecclesial consumerism means that even seminaries have to fight for their share of a market by becoming an intensive expression of the particular section of the church that they represent, so as not to die out, offering a deep engagement, but perhaps not the sort of challenging and broad engagement that one would expect. And so where churches become distrustful of any other theology as unsound or unchristian. So those two contexts, it seems to me, are strikingly similar. But why might theology therefore be important in this context? And this is section 2. And to try and answer this, I actually want to give a theological framing of this shared context, because it seems to me that some of these issues are as old as time. I have to say that in the current context, the work conducted by Reinhold Niebuhr on utopia and anxiety, Reinhold Niebuhr, the very theologian appointed by Robert Oppenheimer to the Institute for Advanced Studies, an act which is understood to be the very roots of CTI, has an extraordinary and particular resonance. This founding professorial appointment that led to CTI and the work he undertook has something remarkable to say to us today. Niebuhr, in his work, defines utopia as a state of perfect liberty and perfect social cohesion. But this very act of describing utopia, he says, demands a theological critique. From a theological perspective, utopia is an impossibility because it is grounded in human nature. Perfect liberty and perfect equality, he says, would require perfect love, which is impossible in history, given the reality of sin and the reality of history and all that it teaches us. Niebuhr argues the following: liberty and harmony, or equality as a principle of ideal harmony, are not absolutely realizable in history. The self-concern of the human requires that he or she be socially restrained. Therefore, absolute liberty is not possible. Social coordination, being dependent upon a social hierarchy, means absolute equality is also impossible. In other words, the relationship of perfect liberty and perfect harmony is possible only under the condition of perfect love, and is therefore not possible in the realm of the political order. But original sin, he says, does not merely end there in ending the realizability of utopian ideas. It also distorts the very way we imagine and think about what a utopia is, and therefore how we conceive of justice. We inevitably, he says, fall prey to the temptation to equate our current notions of justice with perfect justice. This tendency is especially present in utopian thought, and he says runs the danger of resulting in fanaticism, which can only ultimately be overcome by totalitarianism. We live, it seems to me, today in a world which is overwhelmed with utopianism in all kinds of forms. Not the utopias of the Cold War, of communism versus capitalism, but other, much more fractured, much more local utopianisms. But the issue with all utopianism is that when it is not realized, which it can never be because it is utopia, it leads not to hope in something better. It leads instead to profound despair of the condition in which we find ourselves because that utopia has not come about. Utopian views of the world inevitably fuel despair. I want to come back to this towards the end of my talk, where I'll ground things a bit more concretely in current issues. But I want to talk for the moment about the fact that we should note simply the profound capacity that the founding concerns that CTI's original context had continue to evoke for us the need to address these issues theologically today. Indeed, Niebuhr's own connection of his discussion of the human condition with anxiety in his Nature and Destiny of Man may well give us a pathology of why we face these realities. Let me summarize his argument in the briefest and crudest of ways. And I'm going to just say in passing that as a British person, coming to read Niebuhr was something entirely new for me because nobody teaches Niebuhr in the UK, because we all look to Germany, where Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said something rude about Niebuhr, so nobody looks at him. So it's been a good thing for me to come here and be put right. British people think that if something theological is worth saying, it should be said in German. So, which is true. As human beings, Niebuhr says, we are finite and as such mortal, but we are also free to imagine and conceive and reflect on our situation. And in this situation, we become fearful of our own mortality, seeking to transcend the finite self and imagining ourselves to be limitless. Well, anyone who has looked at anything to do with AI and the singularity will be aware of this, but so will all of us who've watched those really terrible programs on Netflix about how to live to 100 as well. Those of us who've explored Ghostbots probably have a sense of what this might mean also. We don't like our finitude. And for Niebuhr, the meeting of these two conditions, finitude and the freedom to reflect upon it, leads to an insecurity about our finitude, which leads us to the existential condition of anxiety. This anxiety, he says, can be overcome by trusting in God and seeking to live into our finitude as human beings and as creatures. But when we do not desire to trust in God, our only other option is to place trust in ourselves and to live into ourselves and push forward our own sense of self-assertion. So ironically, he says, the situation of anxiety leads to a situation of self-assertion and pride because we are anxious because we realize that we are finite, and the only response we can have outside of turning to God is to push ourselves forward. This assertion can express itself in all kinds of ways, and Niebuhr notes 4 of these. The self-assertion of power. I see this personally as the besetting sin of politicians in our age. Niebuhr writes, there is no level of greatness and power in which the lash of fear is not at least one strand in the whip of ambition. This culture is constantly tempted to regard physical comfort and security, power and control and domination as life's final good, and to hope for its attainment to a degree which is beyond human possibility. Secondly, he talks about self-assertion in knowledge, the besetting sin of the life of the contemporary academic. This asserts itself in the certainty of a naturalistic age where it is claimed that philosophy is the final philosophy because it rests upon a rather limited conception of what science is, a certainty which betrays ignorance of its own prejudices and failure to recognize the limits of scientific knowledge. Intellectual pride is thus the pride of reason which forgets that it is involved in a temporal process which evolves and changes, and which imagines itself in complete transcendence over history. Third, he talks about self-assertion in virtue, or the besetting sin of virtue signaling on both sides of our binarized culture wars. Niebuhr states the self mistakes its standards for God's standards. Moral pride is the pretension of finite human beings that their highly conditioned virtue is the final righteousness, and that their very relative moral standards are absolute. Moral pride thus makes virtue the very vehicle of sin. The sin of self-righteousness is responsible for our most serious cruelties, injustices, and defamations against our fellow human beings. And then the fourth is the self-assertion in spiritual pride. And I should say here, as somebody who became an academic having considered becoming a politician and then went on to be a theologian, I feel that I'm got with all of these because I see this as the besetting sin of the theologian in today's world, where the liberal and conservative wings of the church are made worse by their political framings in the theopolitics of our age. Again, to quote Niebuhr, the worst form of intolerance is religious intolerance, in which the particular interests of the contestants hide behind religious beliefs and absolutes. The worst form of self-assertion is religious self-assertion. What goes by the name of religion in the moral modern world, declares a modern missionary, is to a great extent unbridled human self-assertion disguised in religious dialogue. These self-assertions have very profound impacts on horizontal relations between humans and other humans and between humans and the rest of creation. But there is also an irony here, which in an age of despair cannot be lost. Because in the assertion of the self in the context of anxiety, the irony is we actually lose who the self is. The self which understands itself apart from God is a self which desires not to be the self it is. It is the self that desires to be God. And that is just an idol as impotent as any other idol. As John Calvin states in his Institutes, and as a Methodist, I'm always worried I'm going to be struck by lightning when I say John Calvin's name. Sin is a massive inflation of the self, but in that massive inflation, it is actually a loss of the true self. Or in the terms of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as human beings, what we are tempted by is the desire to become our own God. That is the temptation of the serpent, whom he calls the first theologian. And in that we reject our own creatureliness, and we find security not in relation to God, but in relation to desiring to be our own God. In the self-assertion which emerges from our insecurity and anxiety, we actually lose our very humanity, our very sense of self, because we are asserting a humanity and a sense of self which does not come from the true self of being a human and a creature. It does not come from the true self of recognizing that we are finite. We cannot be our true selves unless we understand that we are creatures of a creator. It is perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that the most significant living social theorist, Hartmut Rosa, reflects on the overwhelming nature of the uncontrollability of the world. The self-assertion we engage in both emerges from our insecurity and anxiety, and is an attempt to overcome its incontrollability. Rosa opens what is perhaps the most important book of social theory of the last 50 years, The Uncontrollability of the World, with the following thesis statement. The driving force of that form of life we call modern is the idea, the hope and desire that we can make the world controllable. Yet it is only in encountering the uncontrollable that we really experience the world. Only then do we feel touched, moved, alive. A world that is fully known, in which everything has been planned and mastered, would be a dead world. Rosa, in his work, and I can't commend it to you enough, identifies 4 dimensions of the modern desire for control. The effort to control the world means making it visible, making it physically reachable and accessible, making it manageable, and making it useful. We could imagine all of that in relation to AI, I suspect, as well. The result of this fourfold drive is that the modern human being tends to encounter the world as a point of particular aggression, or as a series of points of aggression, objects to be conquered, mastered, exploited. These, we might say, both compound the current world, the anxiety we have, and our attempt at self-assertion to control the world around us through our own ego. The very assertion of ourselves in an uncontrollable world to try and control it, by which we end up losing who we actually are. It's in this context I want to say that we need, to use Laurie Zoloth's wonderful term, interruption. And that interruption needs to provide a degree of repair. And it's here that I want to begin to turn to my vision for theology. So section 3, how might theology be important? An interruption of our past and present to repair our future. In this situation, if theology is to be able to capture the imagination of our culture and society more generally, it needs to be an interruption into our normal patterns of thinking and living with reflection on God and what that means about our own humanity. This is not in the sense of the number of angels dancing on a pinhead, but instead about understanding that reflection upon God is actually the means by which we will come to understand ourselves as truly human and as truly creatures. One of the texts for my sermon tomorrow is the text from Exodus 3, the call of Moses. And now I want to keep my powder dry for some of that tomorrow, but for now, let me say this in slightly more academic terms. This, by the way, if you were wondering what this is about, is a picture of the burning bush from St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt. And what I really wonderfully love is the fact that if you look closely, there's actually a fire extinguisher there. The French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, Laurie's guy, drawing on rabbinical reflections on the story, points out the interruptive nature of the call of Moses. Moses turns aside to notice the bush which is burning but is not consumed. There is in this an interruption of Moses' normal life. He's going about tending Jethro's flock, and yet he is interrupted with this strange event that he has to notice, turn to, and the rabbinic scholars make a great deal of this. And it elicits, as do many prophetic calls, the response, "Here I am." Moses, we might say, gains a sense of self, of true self, of who he is through encounter with the divine. And there is a grounding in this which is important as well, a taking off of his shoes, not only because he is on holy ground, but a grounding because it points to his creatureliness before God, a grounding by standing in the very clay from whence humanity is made. Crucial to understanding our finitude and creatureliness is understanding who we are in relation to God and in relation to creation. Now, our immediate instinct might be here, as I think it is for Levinas and for Hannah Arendt, to turn immediately to the ethical in relation to this, to look to the freeing of the Hebrew slaves, to look to what we should do. But I want to claim that such a move is a little too hasty. That what we need to do, first of all, is understand who it is that interrupts us, in order that our ethical decision and action can be grounded upon sure ground, and not upon an idol, as we heard yesterday, or upon the self-assertion of virtue or religion, as was part of Niebuhr's anxiety. It is because of who God is that we can understand ourselves as creatures. The concept of a creature, in fact, is a relational concept. You can't be a creature without a creator, nor can you be a creator without a creature. God is now the God who is never now without God's creature, and that shapes everything. It's not for nothing, it seems to me, that some of the greatest social transformers were theologians, John Wesley, of course, being next to God in that, and Martin Luther King being just beneath John Wesley. We don't get our ethics right until we first get our theology right. We won't get our action right unless we get our thinking right. Moses in this story has to know who God is before he can bring the people through to liberation. He has to know that the God of the whole universe, the God who is beyond and transcendent to all that is, the God who is transcendent in the midst of us, is the God on the side of these slaves being persecuted and punished in Egypt. He has to understand the majesty of who that God is, to understand the liberative quality of all that God is doing. So in the story, God makes God's self known in a way which is the grounds of the extraordinary liberative and ethical action that is to follow. The God who knows and hears the sufferings of his people, who hears the account of the cry from their taskmasters. The God who is with them in their sufferings is also the God who is the God of everything, the God who is with all of creation, brought all of creation into being, and is the God who is who is. Who God is the context for the liberative work of God, which Moses will enable and enact. The reason we must ground our ethical action with theological thought is because God is the God who liberates. It's not just something God chooses to do or God could do. It is who God is. Ethics is formed from theology precisely because our notions of the good, of the true, of the right, of the just, of the beautiful are contested notions. And for those of us with faith, they are grounded precisely in the understanding we have of who God is. And it would be difficult for me to conduct a lecture on theology without pointing to my homeboy Karl Barth, who puts it perfectly well and succinctly, which is a miracle, when he says, basically, the Christian doctrine of God is ethics. The Christian doctrine of God is ethics. It is because of who God is that God acts in these ways. But I also think that this means that our concept of God cannot be one which is abstract. Indeed, the very activity that God has of naming God's self makes this plain. We all know, I'm sure, that God describes God's self in that enigmatic way, I am who I am, except for the fact that Ea Asher Ea doesn't really mean that. And I'm sat with Jewish scholars and with Hebrew scholars who are on much firmer ground than me in saying all of this. But we translated I am who I am because the Vulgate translated the Greek, ego eimi ho on, into ego sum qui sum. And we lost a sense of the dynamic, the active, the actualistic, the liberative components of that name. That name also means I will be who I will be, and I will cause to be who I will cause to be. It's a way of saying, if you want to know who I am, look at what I'm about to do. Who I am is the God who liberates these people, who brings forth slaves out of misery, who hears the cry of those in abject desperation. That is why our transformation begins with a transformation of our minds. Rooting our behaviors and choices in understanding and learning who God is and who God shows God's self to be. It's for that reason Paul can write, do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you might discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. The connection of the life of the mind to the life of ethical action is central in this text, just as it is in the unveiling of God's name in Exodus chapter 3. We engage in deep theological thinking in order to know what to do, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. Section 4. What kind of theology, then, do we need? The type of theology this vision requires. I was going to give you a summary of the arguments so far, but I'm going too fast, so I'll skip it. I want to argue that there is a need for a twofold form of theological research in today's world. This is to do with God, as we heard powerfully from Kate Sonderegger yesterday, to which we might index theology proper. And it is to do with God's ways with the world, to which we might index theological illumination of the world. We need advanced research about theology and on theology, and we need advanced research about the world in light of theology. First, we need advanced learning about theology. Without deep and critical research, which speaks with the same kind of authority and academic seriousness as other disciplines, the cultural imagination of our age will consign Christianity to the nursery with other pleasant fables and fairy stories. Research institutions, especially institutions of advanced study like this one, should not be places where the standard or normal answer is acceptable, but places which push for new expressions of deep and old truths in the ever-changing experiences and contexts of our given reality. And that involves constant hard work. I'm struck by the fact that people often say, I don't really understand theology or what it is. And I think sometimes about the fact that if we went to a lecture at the institute down the road by the professor of mathematics, we'd probably all be worried if we did understand it all, because it would mean that he wasn't doing the work that he was supposed to do, which is to break the very contexts and bounds of the limits of knowledge at that point. We need to be doing the same. We should be critically engaging norms and traditions to push them beyond their confines, something driven by research which catalyzes new ways of thinking in order to catalyze new ways of being and doing in organizations, in society, and as individuals. The very form of sustained critical inquiry that we should engage in needs to lead to new and transformative insights, unshackled from normative expectations in which disciplines and traditions live. This is as true of theology as it is of any other discipline. And if we are to re-engage a society that is more educated than it has ever been, and is more apprenticed to critical thinking than it has ever been, we must keep pace with the kinds of deep culture-changing thinking and reflection which is needed for faith once again to shape and transform societies for the good of which we are a part. This research needs to take place within the challenging but centered sense of what truth might be, enabling researchers in theology to understand the deep wells at the center of their faith in the boundless world of inquiry and engagement. The world in which we live is not a world which is tradition or confession bounded, but a world in which the claims of faith are desperately contested, but perhaps even more desperately needed. To be formed in a critical research context should enable people to have the tools with which to respond to the critical engagement of those committed to the secular critiques of religion. We need better theological academics than the academics supplied by other disciplines. We might see this, to borrow language from the first director of CTI. He took the title director rather than chancellor, and a great mentor of mine, Daniel W. Hardy. We might see this as the intensity of our theological inquiry. But alongside this intensity, this deep research into theology itself must simultaneously be an engagement with the extensity of theology's reach. Theology is not just a subject area in itself. It is a method by which we read everything else in the world. It is a method by which we understand creation as creation rather than just one damn thing after another that doesn't make any sense. So second, we need a mode of advanced learning about theology's impact on everything else. C.S. Lewis famously said, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." Faith determines not just what we think about God, but in light of what we think about God, what we think about everything else. Unlike what Lewis says, academic work normally presumes and presupposes the normalcy of forms of study detached from any idea that there might be an existence other than the biological and the material. Most academic study involves a worldview which is essentially atheistic. But theology is called to ask the question, what would it mean? What would it mean for everything if the vast, vast, vast majority of human beings are right? And if there is an existence of a metaphysical reality beyond the biological and the material? What would it mean if the 90-odd% of people in the world who believe that there is something more are correct? What would it mean if God really did exist? And what does that mean in the way that we think about everything else in the world? And that's a rather daring question to ask. But it's also one that depends upon deep theological work being done in the first place. As the former Norris Hulse Professor of Religion, Nicholas Lash, former Norris Hulse Professor of Religion at the University of Cambridge, argues, all human beings have their heart set somewhere, hold something sacred, worship at some kind of shrine. The question instead is not whether we worship, it is what we worship and what that means for how we understand everything else. For him, he says, we are all spontaneously idolatrous in the mode of worship we have. What we think about God affects everything else that we think about. Theology, in this sense, is designed to be a lens with which we understand God's ways with the world so that we can understand all things in relation to God. If we get the lens wrong and it is warped, then we will see the world in a warped way as well. I am blind as a bat, so I always have lenses in my eyes, and my glasses look like the bottom of jam jars. And I am aware that if my daughters put on my glasses, they're probably going to be blinded for life, and I try and pull them off them. But when they put my glasses on, they see everything in this weird and wonderful way. And I can't see anything unless I've got my glasses or my contact lenses in. Until I look through a lens, I can't see the world as it is. Theology is a discipline that should help us see the world better. But in order to see the world properly, the lens itself needs to be shaped right for the right conditions and the right places and the right people. So in these terms, the first kind of theology we need, deep research into theology itself, is the work that we do on the lens. But that work is not just done on the lens with the expectation that the lens is the end of it all, an end in itself. The work is done on the lens so people can look through it and see the world more clearly, more abundantly, more beautifully, more positively, more powerfully. Theology doesn't just cast light as we claim in all of our merch. Theology also refracts light to give us a clearer sense of our vision. In an age of despair, division, and lack of illumination, we need a better lens through which to look. I'm going over, so I'm going to skip this next section. Fifthly and finally, you'll be glad to hear, how does theology have impact? This is the other question I get asked all the time. One of the ways that new and rigorous theologies can have impact in the world is the potential that they have to create spiritual capital, a term produced in part by one of the people sat in this room, John Swinton, whose work I am borrowing for this next paragraph. Thanks, John. Spiritual capital can broadly be understood as the store of value embedded in spiritual, religious, and ethical frameworks that individuals, organizations, or societies can draw upon to inform and shape their behaviors, decisions, and a sense of purpose. At an individual level, spiritual capital might refer to the internal resources individuals possess, such as wisdom, purpose, meaning, and the ethical frameworks of their lives. Organizationally, spiritual capital might mean the leveraging of some spiritual or theological ethical values to shape leadership, corporate culture, decision-making processes, creating socially responsible organizations. And at a societal level, spiritual capital might lead to a collective moral and ethical wisdom that contributes to social cohesion, to justice, to the good, nurturing civic responsibility. Now, it may well be that we live in an age of diminished spiritual capital, and one thing that theology perhaps can do is to try to build some hope in this context. But it could also be that we have the wrong spiritual capital in operation at the moment. And in thinking about this, let's return to where I began this lecture, the context in which we find ourselves. And I want to try and use two illustrations to end this with. Let's deal first of all with the idea of a lack of spiritual capital. Well, I think we heard some of this already from Friederike in the way that she was talking. In the terms of the current context, creating spiritual capital for people as they think about, let's say, AI, is a living concern for theology. It's a living concern because it's not a topic that we have thought about before, but there is much wisdom, to use the term that you used, that we might have to say things about it. What are the guardrails ethically for AI? What can we say about human distinctives in light of superintelligence? What does it mean for us to be confronted by our finitude in terms of what seems a limitlessness in light of something that we have made? What is the notion of consciousness that's involved in this? How do we live alongside one another as creaturely and artificial or made intelligences? How should I think about grief in a context where I can create a ghost bot? Theology has things that are relevant to all of those kinds of issues. When looked at through the lens of theology, they look different. And what that means for us can create spiritual capital, which has the capacity actually to be transformative in the world, to give people resources that they need and are desperately crying out for. But second, what about the context of binarized political realities in which faith is playing an enormous part in dividing us? What about the current theopolitical, by that I mean the intersection of theology and politics? What about the current theopolitical realities we live in, where there is lots of spiritual capital, but it's being deployed both left and right, literally to divide and to engage in vicious circles of destruction, enhanced by and enhancing the very anxiety which we said before was the cause of self-assertion in light of a rejection of God? The problem here, to my mind, is that this theopolitics is based on bad theologies and bad eschatologies or understandings of God's kingdom. I'm going to talk about this very briefly. It seems to me that in this there are two things in operation: purism and absolutism, and that both of these are a warped sense of what it means to believe in the kingdom of God. We hear righteousness being called upon on both sides. We hear the kingdom of God being called upon on both sides. We hear biblical text being used on both sides. But the problem is that what has happened has been a unholy alliance of purism and absolutism. And I have in the lecture a much longer engagement with this as an idea. But we might say that what there is a purism that says that if there is just one little fractional problem with you in light of this whole group over here, I'm going to cancel you because you can't be part of that. And if the reason that I'm doing that is because I have an absolutist idea that it's not just that we're all frail, finite creatures trying to wrestle our ways in a society to a pragmatic settlement, but that what we're actually doing in the political decisions that we're making is bringing about the kingdom of God, so that we believe the kingdom of God is in the hands of our politicians rather than at the hand of Jesus. Jesus never says the kingdom of God is in his hand, at his hand. And yet, in the hands of politicians, this work is being deployed in ways which are vicious. But these approaches of purism and absolutism are approaches which are theologically wrong. Christianity has always believed that we are simul justus et pectator, simultaneously justified and sinful, fallen, simultaneously contingent, and never absolute. The wrong understanding of our humanity and the wrong understanding of divine holiness has evacuated us from our understanding of the frailty of our creatureliness, the frailty of our minds, and this has led to an idealized and binarized political reality. In Niebuhr's term, we've replaced God's account of us with self-assertive virtue and religion, which confuses at all points. And the importance for me is all points. God's ways with us and God in God's self, with our political positions, our political ways, and our self-righteousness. But if we were to shift our theologies on the ground, if we were to say that it isn't the case that you have to make these decisions between liberal and conservative, that Jesus actually has a tax collector and a zealot amongst his disciples. So, if you're worried about having red and blue in your congregation, get over it. If we're in a situation in which we find that the traditional position is also the radical position, perhaps there are ways that we can build some theological capital that will begin to change the mode of discourse and dialogue. Remind ourselves that we are not absolute, but contingent. Remind ourselves that we are not pure, but that we are all weak and frail and finite. These two issues of purism and absolutism are connected in unhelpful cyclical ways. The purism leads to a more absolute, the more absolute leads to greater purism. But it's also the case that they work theologically together. Purity is based on the idea of a realized kingdom, which determines that if God's rule and reign is present in my party, red or blue, then no pollutant is possible, because no pollutant is possible in the perfect life of God. But what would it mean if we could start to change the spiritual capital here? What would it mean to shape the lens more truly? To remind us, for example, that Jesus said that his kingdom was not of this earth, that his kingdom was at hand, not in our hands. To remind people of the radicality of Jesus' interaction with women in his culture and its highly liberative way, not as a liberal position, but actually as a deeply conservative and traditional position. To talk about the significance of Jesus not being a Roman citizen in a Roman colony. to talk about the power of the story of Moses freeing the slaves and taking them not just to liberation, but to a land overflowing with milk and honey. What happens when we realize that the traditional position is the liberative position? And on and on and on. Some words by conclusion. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. For me, to be transformed by the renewing of our mind is a vision of a great old spreading tree whose branches offer home for all kinds of birds and animals and creatures in creation, all kinds of shade for those that cannot climb up it. The point of a big, broad, spreading tree is that to have deep roots is utterly necessary if we are to have broad branches. If the roots are shallow, the tree can never, ever sustain the branches it has. I learned this very powerfully the day that CTI closed for Christmas, when I was having all the staff and all the fellows back for a Christmas party, and about 10 minutes before they were meant to arrive, the tree outside of our house fell down. And the reason it fell down was because the roots were really shallow, and thank God nobody was killed going through. But trees with deep roots can have branches that spread wide, creating space for life and shelter and flourishing. Theology should be a great tree with deep roots. Its roots are designed to be deep not just for its own sake, but to be deep in order to hold the breadth of the limbs on which the branches are based. The more anchored, the more theological we are, the greater our capacity to listen, learn, engage, think, speak creatively and hospitably across the world to others. Our depth is what makes possible our capacity for broad conversation across the big questions of the world. The security that depth brings to us doesn't cut us off from disagreement or difference, but roots us in a centered way that is more concerned to be open and more concerned to be hospitable than to be bounded and to be closed. Such rootedness doesn't remove or cut off the complexity, ambiguity, or argument. It is a rootedness that makes that very condition possible. That is why transformation has to come from the renewing of our mind. It is deep work, intensive work, which has the most extensive effects, the broadest impact. Not placing the theological and the social, the intellectual and the societal, the traditional and the innovative, the liberal and the conservative, the theory and the practice in opposition as if they were binarized, is deeply radical, because the radical nature of any of those classical positions involves deep hospitality because of the roots. It is truly radical, coming from the Latin word radice, meaning rootedness. There can be very little today that is less conformed to the world than that rejection of those nonsensical binaries. There are few things that can be more likely to fulfill the call that Paul issued us 2,000 years ago. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It is to this that CTI is called. And let me end with some words of Martin Luther King on this very verse from Romans. The hope of a secure and livable world lives with disciplined non-conformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood and sisterhood, the trailblazers in human academic, scientific, and religious freedom have always been non-conformists. I'm glad of that because I'm a Methodist. In any cause that concerns the progress of humankind, put your faith in the nonconformist. My hope and vision for CTI is that we might be a place prepared not to conform and always desirous instead to transform our humanity through the renewing of our minds, knowing that by renewing our minds, we transform the branches to make them hospitable and broad and wide and strong. Thank you for your patience.